Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. Inshallah, today I just want to start with an introduction to the topic of tafsir. I felt that there's certain sort of fundamental background information that is important or useful for a person to know before actually getting into the tafsir. So for today, what I was planning on discussing is, number one, if the Quran is clear, as it describes itself as being bayanun lin-nas and a clarification for mankind, or kitabul mubin, a clear book, then does it need explanation? And if that is the case, that it needs explanation, why does it need explanation? How can it be clear and yet at the same time be in need of explanation? That's sort of the first question, or the first point that I wanted to cover today. And the second part that I wanted to cover today, which is building on this first point, is taking a brief historical overview of the development of the science of tafsir as a genre, because this will give some insight into the needs for explanation that arose and how the ulama of the ummah, linguists and mufassirin and others, how they addressed those needs, and basically, how we come to where we are now, where we have a very developed science of tafsir that is devoted to explaining the Quran. Okay, so without further ado, with regards to the question, if the Quran is clear, does it need explanation? Yeah, people who are logging in, if you could just make sure to mute your microphones. Actually, I think I can do that from here. Okay. Yeah, so if the Quran is clear, does it need to be explained? And why is there a need for explanation? To understand this question, I think it's useful to look at this question from a historical perspective, starting from when the Quran was first revealed. When the Quran was first revealed, the Quran was revealed serving multiple purposes. And one of the first and primary purposes of the revelation of the Quran was to serve as a sign for the truth of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that every prophet has been given some ayah, some sign, or some miracle, in other words, that would lead people to believe in him, that would be fit that people would witness that miracle and believe in him. As for the sign that I have been given, although we know that the Prophet ﷺ, from his seerah, there's a number of miracles that he performed, some of them even alluded to in the Quran, like the splitting of the moon, and so forth, or rocks, for example, giving him salam, pebbles in his hands making tasbih. So the Prophet ﷺ was given a host of miracles, but he says the sign that I was given, meaning this is the most important of all the signs that the Prophet ﷺ was given, was a book. He says the sign that I have been given is a book, and so I'm hopeful that I will have the most followers of any of the prophets on Yawm al-Qiyamah, that I will come on Yawm al-Qiyamah with the largest ummah. So the Quran was revealed to be a sign to whom? To those who don't believe in him. So obviously, when the Quran was revealed, and it was revealed in their language, it's natural that anytime you have a text in front of you and you're a speaker of the language, or you hear speech and you're a speaker of the language, that for the most part you will understand what is being said. And if you find most of it to be unintelligible, if you find most of it to be something that is difficult to understand, something that you find is not clear, then that would actually be a sign that there's a problem with that text. I mean, unless it's a sort of a specialist sort of text, something that is directed to, like for example, an advanced physics textbook for someone who has never studied physics in his life. Yes, that would be unintelligible in spite of him being totally fluent in the language in which the text is written. But again, it would be inappropriate for someone to write such a textbook and then direct it to an audience who is incapable of reading that text. You would write such a text for the audience for whom that text is suitable. So it's natural then that if the Quran has been addressed to all of mankind, and first and foremost to the Quraysh, as the Prophet ﷺ was told, وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ, warn your near relatives, your tribe, in the very beginning of his message. Clearly, if it's addressed to them and it's in their language, it should be something that is self-evident, should be something that they're able to read it and understand what is being said. And I think that, is something that it really goes without saying. I don't think that Abu Jahl and Walid ibn al-Mughira and the chiefs of Quraysh were hearing the Quran, and then they needed to open up Tafsir ibn Kathir and say, well, what does this mean? Or when Surah Lahab, Surah Abi Lahab was revealed, تبت يدا أبي لهب وتب ما أغنى عنه ماله وما كسب, to the end of the surah. I don't think Abu Lahab heard this surah and he thought, okay, well, let me open up Tafsir ibn Kathir and see what is this surah saying about me. He would have heard it and he would have understood it. So the Quran, when it was originally revealed to its original audience, was for the most part clear. And in fact, it was not in need of explanation in the sense of a commentary. And so in fact, we find that the number of verses that the Prophet ﷺ explicitly directly explains, meaning Sahaba come to him and they ask him, what does this verse mean? We don't understand it. And so then he answers that question and says, oh, this verse actually is about this. Or he finds the Sahaba understanding a verse in a particular way, and so he says to them, no, what you're understanding is not what is intended here. In fact, this ayah is saying this. There are examples of this, but they're very few and far between. Perhaps only a handful of examples or a few dozen examples where the Prophet ﷺ is directly explaining the meaning of verses of the Quran. And we know that the Quran is although the way that they number the ayahs, the way that they count the ayahs in each surah differs, but basically the Quran is composed of over 6,000 verses, of which the Prophet ﷺ has only explained a few handful. So clearly, the Prophet ﷺ was not sitting and having tafsir classes like what we're about to do, going through verse by verse and explaining to the Sahaba, or explaining to the kuffar even, what are the meanings of these verses. So it naturally follows that they were reading and hearing these verses. And I say hearing because, as you're probably aware, the Arabs at the time of the revelation were for the most part illiterate, including the Prophet ﷺ himself. So they weren't reading it in the sense of reading a book. They were mostly either memorizing it and then reciting it in their prayer, or hearing it recited in the prayer. And even in Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ, much of his mission, much of his preaching, much of the way that he conveyed his message was simply by reciting the Quran in public. And one of the famous incidents of the seerah is you have one of the Sahaba for the first time sort of going out in front of the Kaaba and challenging the Quraysh for the first time, but publicly reciting the Quran. And this is an incident that happened with Sayyidina ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. So now, when they, and for those of you who are familiar with the story, obviously the Quraysh, they didn't come to Ibn Mas'ud and say, what is this you're reciting? Why open up for us Tafsir ibn Kathir, open up for us Tafsir al-Tabari so we can see what does this mean. They understood it, and that is why they were taken aback by what he was reciting. So at a very fundamental level, when the Quran was first revealed, it was at a very fundamental level, when the Quran was revealed, it was clear and it was understood by the listeners. Yet at the same time, we find that the Quran says to the Prophet ﷺ, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. We have revealed to you a dhikr here referring to the Quran, so that you may make clear to mankind that which has been revealed to them. And this possibly poses a problem with what we just said, that the actual number of verses that the Prophet ﷺ himself has explicitly explained is actually very few. So what does it mean here that the Prophet ﷺ was entrusted, is being commanded or being entrusted with the duty of explaining the Quran or making the Quran clear? لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ, so that you may make clear to mankind what has been revealed to them. So one element of that would be that if he finds the Sahaba misunderstanding something, he addresses that misunderstanding. And so one example of that is in the verses about Siyam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ. Eat and drink until the white thread becomes distinct, becomes clear to you from the black thread. I'm making gestures with my hands, but there's no video, so you can't see it. So he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, eat and drink, meaning through the night, until the white thread becomes distinct from the black thread. And so one of the Sahaba actually understood this, that he should take a black thread and a white thread, and when the time of Fajr is coming closer, look and see, is there enough light now that the two are clearly visible, clearly distinct from one another with the naked eye. And this is how he understood. This is how he understood the verse. And so, and in fact, the narration mentions that he had the threads under his pillow, and so as he was having his suhoor, he would pick up the pillow and take a look and see, are the threads, are they visible now? And obviously, you have to keep in mind, this is at a time when there was no artificial lighting, there was no street lights, so all the way up until the Fajr, it genuinely would have been very dark, and so he could very well have done that and not be able to see these threads. So now what the verse actually means is that when you look at the horizon, there's basically the very start of Fajr will be a point at which there is a horizontal band of light, which is being compared here. This is basically a metaphor that is being used, to a white thread, indicating that very first band of light that spreads across the sky, it will be as if there is a white thread separating from a black thread, because the sky is black, and then a thin white band of light appears in the horizon. So this white thread is actually referring to the light of the sun. So when he came and he told this to the Prophet ﷺ, that this is what he had done and this is what he had understood, the Prophet ﷺ said that you must have a very large pillow, because the idea here then being that his pillow must be covering the horizon such that it's covering the light of the sun, and then the light of the sun appeared over the pillow. So, in any case, in fact, actually at this point, Allah then revealed an additional phrase to add to this verse. فَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ. This wording, min al-fajr, was actually revealed after some of the Sahaba misunderstood this verse. Basically saying, eat and drink until the white thread becomes distinct to you from the black thread of dawn, meaning that what we were looking at is the horizon. So making it clear that you're looking for the dawn, the light of dawn, the start of the light of dawn. But this is an example of something that the Prophet ﷺ explained. If we look for these sorts of explanations where the Prophet ﷺ is directly explaining the Quran and saying, no, this is not what it means, this verse means this. There's not a lot of examples. And even where we have the Prophet ﷺ explaining the verses, sometimes his explanation is, you could say, sort of illustrating a meaning that can be taken from the verse and not explaining at the level of I don't know what this verse means, let me explain what this verse means. So, an example of that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the verses about jihad. He says, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ مِنْ قُوَّةٍ. Prepare for them what you are able of strength, of power. وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ مِنْ قُوَّةٍ. So the Prophet ﷺ, he comments on this verse. He says, أَلَا إِنَّ الْقُوَّةَ الرَّمِي. أَلَا إِنَّ الْقُوَّةَ الرَّمِي. That truly power is archery. That archery is this power that you should be preparing for the purpose of war. And so now here, this meaning that the Prophet ﷺ has given, clearly he's not saying, and if you read through the actual tafsirs of this verse, you'll find that Mufassirin, they generally point this out, that this doesn't mean that archery is what this verse is, that this verse simply means, learn archery. But that rather what the Prophet ﷺ was doing here was explaining, that archery is one of the very important forms of strength and power for war that is needed to be successful on the battlefield or in jihad. So so here what he's doing is he is explaining this verse. He is making clear this verse, but he's not saying this verse means this. He is explaining a point that enters under the meaning of the verse, because he wants. And why is he doing that? Because basically everyone is going to learn, particularly at that time, anyone who is interested in learning, basically the arts of war. The first thing that he's going to start learning is swordplay. So he is not concerned that there will be, that the Sahaba are not learning to use swords. And certainly he doesn't mean that no, you don't need to learn how to use swords. You just need to learn archery. But he is perhaps concerned that archery is something that many people would overlook learning. But archery has a great deal of strategic value on the battlefield, because obviously when you have archers, you can position them in strategic locations that can significantly change the course of battle, and can significantly change the way that the battle is conducted. And we see an illustration of that with the story of what happened at the Battle of Uhud, the important role the archers played by not fulfilling the command that the Prophet ﷺ had given them, and how the archers, had they've actually done what the Prophet ﷺ commanded them, the Muslims would not have been defeated at Uhud. So this is an illustration of how archery can be a very important form of power that can change or affect the course of war or the course of battle. So basically the verse is talking about learning archery. And again, if someone were to take this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ very literally, and I've actually come across people who do this. I actually remember years ago when I was younger, one brother saying that, I'm practicing learning archery because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Ala inna al-quwwata rami." And again, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with learning archery. I think it's actually good for people to take up different sports and things and things like that. And so certainly archery. Hold on a second. Let me just see if I can. Just a reminder, anyone who logs in, please remember to mute your microphone. Right. So this brother was learning archery, and so I said to him, well, I don't think that archery is really that essential now. And he was like, yeah, that's true, but it's a sunnah. And then, which is up until this point, I think his point was okay, but then he says, what if maybe one day you're on the battlefield and you don't have weapons, and it could still be useful. And again, this taking the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in this fashion, in this very literal fashion, is clearly it doesn't make sense. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ, for the modern context, that would mean develop modern technology. The major world powers today, particularly from a military perspective, are the ones who are the most technologically advanced, and quite frankly, no country that is able to match them technologically would be able to stand against them on the battlefield. So it goes without saying that would be the application of this verse for the modern context. So even here with this example, you have the Prophet ﷺ is explaining the verse, but his explanation is not a direct tafseer in the sense of this verse said this, and the meaning of these words is this, and quwwa means this, and the usage of the word quwwa here is it's general, and so therefore it encompasses all forms of quwwa, all forms of strength, all forms of power that would be effective for this military context. So even in this sense, the Prophet ﷺ is not explaining the verse in this sense. So, but this is one element of the Prophet ﷺ's explaining the Quran. But another element, and this is probably the more prevalent form of the Prophet ﷺ explaining the Quran, is that the Quran in general contains certain ahkam, certain commandments, certain rules and regulations, but without going into a tremendous deal of detail. So, for example, the Quran will say in many places, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ, establish prayer. Establish the prayer. But what is the prayer? What is salah? Salah in the Arabic language simply means dua, meaning up until the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the time of revelation, salah was simply a word that you could say was a synonym for dua. So here, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ does not mean make dua. Aqimus Salah means perform the prayers, the five obligatory prayers, fulfilling all of their obligations. So, for example, Fajr is 2 rak'ahs, and the particular fashion, that in every rak'ah that you have to start with Takbirat al-Ihram, and then you stand while standing, you read certain surahs, and then you go into ruku and sujood and so forth, and the specific order and the specifics of how salah is performed. And then Dhuhr is 4 rak'ahs, Asr is 4 rak'ahs, Maghrib is 3 rak'ahs, Isha is 4 rak'ahs. None of this is mentioned in the Quran. The particular timings of these prayers is not really mentioned in the Quran. So a lot of the details of these rules and regulations, or these foundations of the Sharia, are the generalities are mentioned in the Quran, but the explanation of them is usually found in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And so, for a person to explain the Quran and understand the Quran properly, because one of the purposes of the Quran is to provide. So one thing we said was that it's to be a sign, and that's actually a point we'll come back to later on when we talk about the concept of ijaz al-Quran, or the miraculous nature of the Quran. But one of the purposes is to be a book of guidance. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. So it's almost as if these two meanings that I mentioned are actually contained in this verse. And this is basically when you read in the Quran from beginning to end, the first time the Quran actually introduces itself, it says ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is the book in which there can be no doubt. Meaning, this is a clear sign of the truth of the message of Muhammad ﷺ. This is a clear sign of the truth of the religion of Islam, and it is guidance for those who fear Allah. It's guidance for the muttaqeen. So, a fundamental purpose of the Quran is to provide guidance for the believers, and part of that guidance entails ahkam that are to be practiced, norms that are to be upheld in life and in society. In fact, the Quran is laying down an entire way of life, which includes worship, it includes financial transactions, it includes the family system, war and peace, international relations. It includes everything. And so the Prophet ﷺ in his life embodied those teachings, and he showed how these teachings are practiced. And that also includes specific rules and regulations that are left, the details are left unaddressed in the Quran, are addressed in the Sunnah. So to understand the Quran properly, you would have to be familiar with the whole of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. When I say the whole of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that doesn't necessarily mean that each and every single authentic hadith, that if you don't know it, that you cannot interpret the Quran. But the Sunnah as a whole, if you're not familiar with it, then there's a lot of the guidance of the Quran that you might not understand or grasp, because it was the job of the Prophet ﷺ to show us how to carry it out. And that's why when Aisha radiallahu anha was asked to describe the character of the Prophet ﷺ, she said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ. His character, his khuluq, was the Quran. Obviously, it doesn't mean this literally. Again, let's not take things too literally. If you take everything literally, you will misunderstand ayat of the Quran and hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But this is sort of in Arabic they call mubalagha, that this is hyperbole, that she is saying as if he was the Quran walking on the face of the earth. So this is actually a very powerful expression of what it means that the Prophet ﷺ clarified the Quran. So there are ahkam, the details of which the Prophet ﷺ explicitly explained, sometimes in his words, sometimes in his actions. For example, with salah, he would have instructed the Sahaba by his words on various aspects of the salah, answered some of their questions. For example, taught them what do you do when you forget how many rak'ahs you've prayed, things like that. Then he would have also been performing it and showing them by his example, and so forth for the rest of the ahkam. So we have these ahkam, but even broader than the ahkam is just the ethos of Islam and the moral teaching of Islam. All of this he embodied it, and so a knowledge of this is very important for understanding the Quran, and particularly if someone is engaging in tafsir, specializing in tafsir, that knowledge of the Sunnah is a requirement, because if you strip it of this context of Sharia norms that the Prophet ﷺ enacted, implemented, and embodied, then there's a lot of things in the Quran that you could simply misunderstand them, like وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ, or even وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةِ. If we don't refer to zakah based on the example of the Prophet ﷺ, someone could very well come along and say that zakah means charity. We know from the context of the verses that clearly zakah is talking about some sort of charity. So, and the Quran has, all these rules and regulations you Maulanas have come up with. This is not anywhere in the Quran. So anyone who is given charity is fulfilling the command of the Quran. So, for example, if someone comes along and let's say someone who's extremely wealthy, a billionaire, and gives $1 in charity, he's given charity. So, but obviously it would be preposterous for anyone to suggest that this person is charitable. But that aside, if you don't look at the Sunnah, of the Prophet ﷺ, who is to say that his obligation is not fulfilled? Who is to say when his obligation has been fulfilled? This is not made clear in the Sunnah. This is with regards to the ahkam, but even with things that are not specific legal rulings, you have to understand them in light of this, not just in light of the Sunnah, but even in light of the rest of the Quran. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in Surah Al Imran, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. He is the one who has revealed to you the book. It contains verses that are clear and explicit, and it contains verses that contain some degree of ambiguity, منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب. It contains clear verses that are the foundation of the book, and other verses that are unclear. So in other words, saying that you need to understand the whole of the Quran together. So this requires someone understanding the whole of the Quran together, and also understanding the Quran in light of the Sunnah, because all of them are revelation. And the Quran itself has mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ will make clear the Quran. So if you ignore the clarification of the Prophet ﷺ and interpret the Quran based entirely on what you have understood, then this basically, this then becomes problematic, because you are in fact then ignoring something that the Quran itself has said about itself, that it is the job of the Prophet ﷺ to explain it. And so I think what we can take away from the points that we've discussed so far is that from a linguistic perspective, the language of the Quran was largely clear for its original intended audience. And then there is an additional aspect of clarification of the Quran that the Prophet ﷺ engaged in, of things that would not have been obviously and immediately clear and need to be made clear by his clarification, as the Quran itself has told us. But this is in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. As we move away from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, two problems arise. One is that you have people become Muslims who don't know the Arabic language. People become Muslims who don't know the Arabic language, and so it goes without saying that what is clear, obviously clear, even to Abu Jahl and Walid ibn al-Mughira and Abu Lahab, when they hear the Quran, in spite of them not believing in the Quran, is not clear to this person who is a Muslim who believes in the Quran, because he simply doesn't have that basic tool, which is knowledge of the Arabic language. So it requires some sort of explanation. And so on that level, even a basic, straightforward translation of the Quran is a form of tafsir. Because for the person who doesn't know the even for the person who doesn't know what the meaning of for the person who doesn't know the meaning of the Arabic, clearly, all of the Quran needs to be explained. That, I think, is something that is fairly straightforward and goes without saying. But someone might think that that is relatively a straightforward matter, because the Quran is as it says, bayanun linnas, a clarification for mankind, and it is kitabun mubin. It's a clear book, or a book that makes things clear. So that being the case, anyone with basic competency should be able to translate the Quran, and then any reader should be able to more or less read the Quran, or read the translation of the Quran, and understand it. And on one level, there's some truth to that, although the first part of that is not exactly true. Not anyone can translate the Quran. This idea, if anyone has it, get it out of your head. Not anyone with basic competency in the Arabic language can simply, produce a competent translation of the Quran, because, as we said, there are already aspects that require knowledge of the bayan of the Prophet ﷺ, that if a person is not aware of, the way that he chooses to translate certain verses, even if he was a master of the Arabic language, might be affected by his lack of knowledge of that bayan of the Prophet ﷺ, that clarification of the Prophet ﷺ, in the various forms that we mentioned. So, and that's assuming that he has mastery of the Arabic language. But on one level, it's true that if you have a good, competent translation of the Quran, and I think most of you will have at some point read some translation of the Quran, or at least translation of part of the Quran, you can read it and for the most part understand a lot of what is being said, because once again, it's not written in code. It's written in relatively clear, simple language. It's not written as a sort of technical textbook, like an advanced physics textbook that will be for, as we mentioned, that will be for a person who has not studied even the basics of physics. As he starts reading it, it's just gibberish. Not because he doesn't know the English language. He might he might have a PhD in English literature, but give him an advanced physics textbook and he'll be lost, because he doesn't have the prerequisite knowledge of that field. That is basically sort of the entry level requirement to be able to engage that text. He doesn't have it. The Quran is not that type of book. The Quran is something that for in terms of the language, it would have been clear to anyone who had knowledge of the Arabic language. So the first problem is we have people who become Muslim or even don't become Muslim, people who are interested in reading the Quran and they don't know the Arabic language. But there's another element to all of this, which is that all languages in the languages that we speak, all languages, evolve and change over time. There's no language that stands still, frozen in a particular moment in time, such that from that year onward, nobody uses any new words or new expressions that were not being used. I mean, I know that when I was in school, kids were using new expressions that even their parents' generations would hear them and think, what in the world does that mean? Now that I'm a bit older, I see the same thing, that you have these young kids use expressions or use words that I'm like, what does that mean? And I consider myself to be a fairly well-educated person, but it's not a matter of education or lack of education. It's just that the way people use language is always evolving. So we see this at least in the modern era, certainly at a micro level, even from generation to generation. There's always evolution in the way that expressions are being used. Expressions that were originally being used for a certain meaning, their meaning starts evolving or changing. Expressions that were used in one fashion are now being used in another fashion. There's a lot of linguistic sort of shift going on. I mean, if you look in the English language, with the Quran, we are separated from the era of revelation by 1400 years. 1400 years ago, there was not anything called the English language. And I think English actually only goes back about 1,000 years. Before that, you have Anglo-Saxon. And Anglo-Saxon, if you want to learn Anglo-Saxon, it will basically be taught to you in the university as a foreign language. The way that you would learn German, you would learn Anglo-Saxon. And obviously, Anglo-Saxon, English might have evolved from Anglo-Saxon with influence of other languages, particularly French and so forth. But the distance between the two is so great that they're basically two different languages. We look at, you could look at, fine English literature. Shakespeare is generally considered to be, one of the pinnacles of English literature. You read Shakespeare, and you will find a lot of the language is actually difficult. You don't understand what is being said, or he's using words in different ways. Not all of it, much of it will be intelligible to anyone who has knowledge of the English language, but there will be also much of it that, simply speaking, if you don't have a commentary, you won't know what is being said, either because you don't know the meanings of the words, or because the way that the words are used has changed, or because it's an idiomatic expression that refers to something that basically people at that time would have had cultural knowledge of, that over time has been lost. As an example of an idiomatic expression, I can't think of anything offhand, but or even you could say cultural references or literary references. In the English language, one reference, and then this might not even be particular just to the English language, it might be across the European languages, is crossing the Rubicon. Crossing the Rubicon means you've passed the point of no return. For those of you in the chat, who here knows what that expression means and where it comes from? Crossing the Rubicon. Just type if you know what I'm referring to, type it in the chat box. Okay, let me unmute people and see if somebody knows. Somebody wants to just say it. Any takers? Crossing the Rubicon. Is everybody asleep? Anyone knows what crossing the Rubicon means, or where that reference comes from?
Oh, look at that.
maybe that was not the best idea.
I'm giving you this excellent job of
Crossing the Rubicon. No, okay. All right, I'm just going to assume now that that nobody knows what I'm talking about. Crossing the Rubicon is a reference to an incident with Julius Caesar when Julius Caesar brought back his army and more or less declared war on the government in Rome by bringing, rather than standing down, by bringing in the army under his command across the Rubicon River, which was basically, in Roman law, strictly prohibited. As general of the army, he should have stood down before re-entering Rome. And so his crossing the Rubicon was considered an act of war. And so in Roman history, this is an infamous incident. And because of the centrality of Roman history and Roman civilization to Western civilization, this then becomes a famous literary allusion or historical allusion that is then used in literature. It may be not used as much now as it used to be, but you will probably still find that good quality writers know this reference and may even use it, and so you'd have to scramble for a dictionary or I guess these days for Google to try and figure out what in the world does this mean. And so here it's not a question of knowing the meanings of the words. Crossing is a relatively straightforward word. Obviously is relatively straightforward. Rubicon would probably be unfamiliar to anyone who is not familiar with this example, but it's just the name of a river. It's not, it's not a word that you need to know the meaning of per se. You just need to know that this is the name of this river. But even if you knew these three pieces of information, you would still not understand what this expression meant because you don't have the context and the background. So there are these different elements of language that, as you move away from the time of the time in which a linguistic text was originally composed, there will start to be more and more of a gap between the reader or the listener and the original text, even if he's a native speaker of that language. And so certainly this is something that has happened with the Quran. This is something that has happened with the Quran that we are now 1400 years removed from the revelation of the Quran. And so even for Arabs, with being native speakers of the Arabic language, particularly those of them who are literate. When I say literate, I don't mean just like the basics of reading and writing, but have a general level of literacy and have gone to schools in Arab countries and have taken Arabic language as a subject and have read some degree of Arabic literature. Depending on their levels of engagement with the Arabic language or the quality of education that they have received. And obviously this goes even for anyone in any language. Much of the Arabic text of the Quran is still clear for them. So there's a lot of things they read it and they know that this kitab means book and shajara means tree and dhalika is referring to that and hadha refers to this and so forth. So much of its language is still clear for them, but there is a great deal that will not be clear. And so in that sense, even the native speaker of the Arabic language will have things that need to be explained to him. Now we come to a third element of this, which is that Remember we said that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ to be a sign. It was revealed to be a miracle. And we'll talk about the subject of I'jaz al-Quran, inshallah, in more detail when we do the historical overview of the development of Tafsir, which is looking like it's going to be next week because we've already spent a good bit of time on this. But the Quran being a sign, being miraculous, in large part what it entails, and we'll talk about this in more detail inshallah next week, but in large part what it entails is that the Quran's language is very eloquent. In fact, it is the peak of eloquence. And part of that eloquence means that it is very rich with meaning. And it is, or in other words, it's imbued with layers of meaning. And so, someone who is, for example, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ would have been a master of, someone who would have been a master of the Arabic language and a master of Arabic poetry and have, a very fine, very high, refined literary taste, would have understood the Quran and would have taken meanings from the Quran that other people didn't. And we saw this example that some of the Sahaba, they misunderstood فَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ. Some of them took it in a very literary fashion. Some of them took it in a very literal fashion. Some of them took this verse in a very literal fashion and they thought it meant you should have an actual, black and white string and look at them and see is Fajr appeared yet? Can you tell the two strings apart? Whereas others, many of the Sahaba, certainly the more knowledgeable of the Sahaba, I'm confident that Abu Bakr and Umar would have understood this verse immediately. Ibn Abbas would have understood this verse immediately. That what is intended here is not what this other Sahabi, Adi ibn Hatim, had understood, that you look at take an actual black and white string and look at it, but that this is a metaphorical reference to the first band of light that appears on the horizon at the time of dawn. So they would have understood this metaphor. So, this is maybe an obvious example, but additional layers of meaning, not everyone will understand them. And this is what, for example, Ali radiallahu anhu, in his time when he was Khalifa in Kufa, by this time there was already some ghulu or some extremism appearing among some people who were exaggerating about the status of Ali, and so he would get asked certain questions. And so he was asked, is there any special knowledge that was given to you, meaning to you, the Ahlul Bayt, not given to anyone else? And he said, no, except for what is in the Sahifa, the scroll, which was basically a scroll in which he had written 13 or so hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ that he had heard directly from the Prophet ﷺ. أو فهما يؤتاه الرجل في القرآن, or some understanding that a person will be given in the Quran. That not everyone is given the same level of understanding and insight into the Quran. The person who reads it, ponders it, reflects on it, particularly if he has the tools to do so in terms of mastery of the Arabic language and knowledge of its context and knowledge of its background and knowledge of the bayan of the Prophet ﷺ, will deduce from it subtle secondary meanings beyond the surface level meanings that will not be immediately obvious to others. And so some examples to illustrate this point. We have a narration from Umar radiallahu anhu that when he was Khalifa, when he would have regular sittings with the companions, the senior companions who had attended Badr. So these are the top of the companions. Generally, it was known amongst the companions that the best of them were those who were at Badr. In fact, there's a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said that Jibril came to him and he said, "Who do you count as the best among you?" Right, actually, I think it's Jibreel speaking to another angel. Allah, I don't remember now. He said that the best amongst them are those who attended Badr. This is who they count as the best amongst them. And so Jibreel says, likewise for us, we count as the best amongst us those of the angels who attended Badr. So this is a very high maqam amongst the Sahaba. This is something that is well known, that the maqam of the Badriyin is not like the maqam of those other than them. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said to Umar, ما يدريك يا عمر لعل الله اطلع على أهل بدر فقال اعملوا ما شئتم فقد غفرت لكم. What would make you know, Umar, that perhaps Allah has already looked at the people of Badr and said to them, do whatever you choose, do whatever you want, I've already forgiven you. So this is a very high maqam. So he had a regular gathering with the companions who had attended Badr. And in this gathering, he included Ibn Abbas, who at the time is a young boy. Ibn Abbas, the cousin of Abdullah ibn Abbas, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, for whom the Prophet ﷺ had made dua, Allahumma faqihhu fi ad-din wa 'allimhu at-ta'wil. Oh Allah, give him deep understanding of the religion and teach him ta'wil, teach him the understanding of the Quran, the meanings of the Quran. So some of these Sahaba, they objected, that obviously it's not appropriate for him to be here in this gathering when we have sons the same age as him and you haven't included them. Why have you included him? So Umar thought, okay, I'm going to show them why I've included him. So when they were gathered, he asked them, what do you understand from the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ, Surah Al-Nasr, when the aid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the victory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes and the opening of Mecca, Fathu Mecca, وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ فَوَاجًا, and you see people entering into the religion in droves. فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ تَوَّابًا. At that time make tasbih and hamd of your Lord. Truly he has ever been tawwab, forgiving of those who turn to him in repentance. So he said to them, what do you understand from these verses? And so they said that, Allah is saying that when he gives us victory and when the Fatah of Mecca happens. And so, by the way, this is part of the tafsir, that al-Fath here refers to Fathu Makkah. It's not stated in the verse, but from the context, the Sahaba knew that this is what is being referred to, Fathu Makkah. When this happens and you see people entering into the religion in droves, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding us that we should make tasbih of him. So this is basically how they explained it. And some of them said, it's best not to comment if we don't have knowledge or what have you. So this explanation that some of the Sahaba had given, Umar returned to Ibn Abbas and he said, Ibn Abbas, he asked him, is this what you understand from the surah? He said, no. He said, tell us, what do you understand from the surah? So Ibn Abbas said that this is the ajal of Rasulullah ﷺ. This is the end of the lifespan of the Prophet ﷺ. Allah is letting him know that this is the sign that you're reaching the end of your life. So be prepared for it. فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْهُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ تَوَّابًا. And so Umar said, I don't understand anything from the surah other than what you have just mentioned, what you have just said. And so from that they came to realize that, okay, this is why he has preferred Ibn Abbas and given him the status amongst us. So this is something that is, knowing the linguistic meanings, this is something deeper than that. And this is something that not everyone will immediately know. Now, so someone might ask, well, where did Ibn Abbas get this from? Where did Ibn Abbas get this interpretation from? And I think, wallahu alam, one thing that can be said is that knowing the life of the Prophet ﷺ and the instructions that he's been receiving throughout, Prophet ﷺ has been working from the time that that revelation started to fulfill his mission. And so here, this tasbih and hamd and reference to Allah being tawwab. Tawwab means Allah turns to the people who turn to him. And particularly those who turn to him in repentance, he turns to them and gives them forgiveness. So in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling him, when this happens, your mission will be coming to an end. And so the only thing left for you at that point is to seek forgiveness for any shortcoming and to glorify me and be prepared for coming back to me. And this is similar to when we finish the salah, we say astaghfirullah, 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 hamdu salam, kasalam, tabarak ya dhal jalali wal ikram. Anytime you finish an amal, or anytime you finish some amal for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're encouraged to do istighfar, realizing that whatever amal you have done, whatever good action you have done, there's bound to be some shortcoming in it. So turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with forgiveness, because this is appropriate to do it at the time when the amal is ending. And so there's then this connection between this theme that is present in the Sharia, in examples like this with Salah, that is present here in this ayah. So this is an example of Ibn Abbas, because of his awareness of the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ and the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, and also the Sharia norms that have been established by the Prophet ﷺ, employing all of that in understanding this verse. So understanding the verse in tafsir is not just at the level of this word, I don't know what it means, what does it mean? Yes, that's part of tafsir. But also understanding what is the purpose and the intent behind the verse is also part of tafsir. And then even beyond that, there are levels of understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to some over others. The more knowledge that a person has, the more sincerity that he has, the more time that he spends reading and reflecting on the meanings of the Qur'an, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reveal to him from its meanings. So, and this comes back to the balagha of the Qur'an. This comes back to part of what makes the Qur'an mu'jiz, is that, and this is in fact the description of the Qur'an that was reported from Ali radiallahu anhu himself, that he said that, as we said before, that he mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give understanding of certain verses of the Qur'an that he doesn't give to some of his slaves, that he doesn't give to others, meaning by that that this has nothing to do with me receiving direct knowledge from the Prophet ﷺ. This is, maybe I've been given understanding of certain verses that others have not been, but not because I have been given some special sort of knowledge that is secret from everyone else, like what some people are suggesting. Ali radiallahu anhu himself, when he describes the Quran, he says, "La yashba'u minhu al-ulama." Scholars, people of knowledge, will never get their fill of it, because there's always something for them to discover. وَلَا يَخْلُقُ عَنْ كَثْرَةِ الرَّدِّ, or لَا يَخْلِقُ عَنْ كَثْرَةِ الرَّدِّ. No matter how much you repeat it, it never wears out, it never becomes old. So there's always meaning to be found in it. And because it's intended to be guidance for mankind, being the last revelation, because there's no prophethood after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there is meanings that people will continue to discover until the end of this ummah, until Yawm al-Qiyamah. People will continue to discover meanings and to discover guidance in it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reveal to them that maybe you won't find written in any book of tafsir that you know the Mufassirin have written in the past. People will continue to find meaning and find lessons and find guidance in it until Yawm al-Qiyamah. And this is part of what makes it miraculous. And so, certainly a book like this is in need of explanation in the sense that not everyone is or can be at this level of understanding. So, in any case, I think we can basically wrap up with that. Inshallah, with our next session, we'll actually go over the historical development of just a brief overview of the historical development of tafsir, because that's also it's sort of important for us to understand that now when we try and understand the Quran for us today, or to explain the Quran today, we're coming after 14 centuries of scholarship that the Ummah has produced for that purpose. And that scholarship is tremendous. And it's not limited just to the books of tafsir. It's actually, in fact, all of the sciences of the Sharia and of the Arabic language serve that purpose. So it's important to have just a bit of perspective on where the moment that we are in the historical development of tafsir, which we are now going to be trying to engage at a very basic level, just taking drops from that ocean. But it's important to understand where we are in respect to that. So inshallah we'll touch on that next week, and not in this session as I'd originally intended. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك لا اله الا انت استغفرك واتوب اليك. If there's any questions, I guess you can type your questions. Should I unmute all so that if anybody wants to just use the microphone? Because when I tried unmuting them before, I guess let me go ahead and do that if anybody wants to just ask their question. Yeah, I've unmuted everyone. It seems nobody has any questions, or at least they're not asking any questions. So, I don't know. Maybe we'll get some feedback afterwards about if they have problems with the audio or what have you. Okay, so I think we'll wrap up with that. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. والسلام